All right, so welcome everyone here for the third of our Scholar in Your Residence program. Are you seeing my screen, I hope?
Yes.
Yes.
Great,
Yep. It looks good,
Okay.
Andy.
good. So this is, again, the third meeting, and excuse me. And so we're going to have an interview with Roger Price, the author of When Judaism
Link
Meets
address
Science.
saved.
And we're going to have an interview panel of Sue Scharstein, Steve Jarrett, and Jay Yablon, and I'll moderate this. Unfortunately, Steve was not able to join us tonight. But he gave me his questions, and we'll move forward with that. So I hope everyone's preparing for Passover tonight. Maybe after this meeting, we could all do a Zoom search for hummus. If people could go on mute if they're not talking, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. All right, so like I said, this is the third event, and I just want to thank the support that I've gotten from the Adult Ed Committee, co-chaired by Gary Reich and Rob Fox, and also the support provided by Rabbi Spitzer, Jack Mincer, and Josh Cooper Ginsburg. And if you want to see these previous presentations, they are available on the synagogue website. So I think you go to the education tab and the adult ed tab, and there you should see the previous presentations. If you have a question tonight during the talk, during the discussion, please use the chat feature and I'll try to monitor it. If it's very topical, a question to the topic being discussed, I may ask it then. Otherwise, I may hold it until the end of the discussion, and we'll have a just talk, question and answer at the end. All right, so tonight we're having a discussion with Roger Price, the author of, like we said, When Judaism Meets Science. And he also runs the website Judaism and Science, a forum on fact, fiction, and faith. I highly recommend you're looking at that site. There's a lot of very good information there, very interesting discussions. So Roger was born and raised in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois, long before Barack Obama decided to settle there. He is a graduate of the University of Michigan, where he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa and received a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Chicago Law School, where he served as an editor of the Law Review. Following a clerkship for United States District Court Judge Abraham Lincoln Morovitz, Roger entered private practice. He retired recently from Seyfarth Shaw LLP. Schooled in a conservative congregation, Roger was a member of the July 1964 Aliyah at Brandeis Camp Institute, now Brandeis Collegiate Institute, in California, where he met and studied with Mordechai M. Kaplan. Subsequently, he became president of the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation in Evanston, Illinois, and then president of the Federation of Reconstructionist Congregations in Haverot, now the Jewish Reconstructionist Federation. He is currently a member of Beth Emet, a Reformed congregation in Evanston, Illinois, and has spoken and written on numerous Jewish topics over the years, and now is concerned primarily with Judaism and science. Roger is married to, as we met, the remarkable Marilyn Price. He is a proud father of Matt and Sarah, and the button-popping pappy of 3. So that's about Roger Price. Let me just quickly introduce also our interview panel. Susan Scharstein is a PhD biochemical engineer with expertise in biomanufacturing, particularly therapeutic antibodies such as Herceptin and Avastin. She is currently a professor of nanobioscience at SUNY Polytechnic Institute. Steve Jarrett is a retired physician, a physiatrist, and was medical director for the Northeast portion of New York State for the New York State Department of Health. Jay Yablon is a patent attorney and theoretical physicist. His physics interests include nuclear and particle physics, cosmology, quantum gravitation, thermodynamics, and condensed matter. He is, of course, also a past president of Congregation of Good Adachim, something that I recommend many more people should take on that task. All right, so let me stop sharing. And now let's start talking about this book. So the book, When Judaism Meets Science, was published in 2019. So although, it's a relatively recent book, as science goes, it's of course already out of date, but it's still very relevant to many issues occurring in today's world. Just so you know, if you want, a copy is available in the synagogue library. I thought that it was a very well-written book, easy for the layperson to read. Roger does an excellent job of introducing multiple topics from the Torah, rabbinic sources, and scientific information. He challenges typical understanding of biblical stories and ethical difficulties. So welcome, Roger. My question to you is, the book, one of the things I found interesting in the book was that it forced me to think about Torah, Tanakh, various Jewish literature, and the Jewish response to the world but it did it through the lens of science, modern science. But at the same time, Roger, you're a lawyer. You don't have the trappings of what Jay told us. You're not a rabbi. You're not a scientist. So how did you come about writing this book, When Judaism Meets Science?
Well, first of all, Andy, thank you very much for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you and the folks at Agudat Achim. It's an interesting issue, the fact that I'm not a lawyer, that I was a lawyer, but I'm not a rabbi and I'm not an accredited scientist. And yet I wrote a book that no rabbi has written and no scientist has written. And that people can puzzle about why that is. But I can say this, that and Jay would understand, and if there are any other lawyers out there, they would understand. If you practice law for 40 years, you learn how to identify issues, you learn how to identify claims, and if you do litigation, which is what I did, not only with respect to my clerkship in the federal court, but as a practitioner, you learn how to separate the wheat from the chaff. You hear people tell all sorts of stories in support of whatever issue they're pursuing or defending. You learn how to look at evidence. You learn how to weigh evidence and find out what's credible and what's not. And that's what I brought to bear on the book. Now, with respect to writing the book, I retired really now 10 years ago from the practice of law. And I had always been interested in Judaism and always interested in science. But as a practitioner, sometimes you don't have the luxury of having the time to read what you want to read in the way you want to read it. But once I retired, I had the ability to really down into both Judaism and science. And what I was interested in was how those two interacted. What was the interplay between Judaism and science? After all, these are two of the great approaches to some of the core issues that we ask all the time, which is, who are we and where did we come from? And what I found out, and so I began this exercise really out of general curiosity. What I found out very quickly was that there were very, very, very few books on Judaism and science. In the introduction to my book, I list all 7 that I found. Now, 7 may seem like a lot, but if you were in the Christian community, you would have hundreds of books, maybe thousands of books on Christianity and science. It seemed to me at the time that a new one was coming out every week. But in the Jewish world, not so much. And the ones I found focused for the most part, on one of two topics, either creation or evolution. And they didn't address the issues that I was interested in. They didn't talk about how science applied to the Torah text. They didn't talk about how science and Judaism interact on the issues of the day, whether it's abortion or allergies or violence involving firearms or vaccinations. And they sure didn't look ahead to the future. And for a moment, I thought I was going to have to write the book I wanted to read. But I realized very, very soon that I didn't have the temperament and I didn't have the knowledge base to do that. And when I was talking to my kids about this, they suggested I write a blog. And I said, that sounds good. What's a blog? And they explained it to me. And I said, well, I can do that. And I started writing small essays on discrete topics. And after about 7 years, I had over 50 essays, well over 100,000 words. And I thought it might be possible to rearrange this material in a way that could become a book. And I would have to do some editing, and I'd have to do some updating, and I'd have to do some rewriting, and probably some other things the publisher would want. But I could do that. And as I was doing my writing and developing this concept, another one of my motivating factors was that I became increasingly concerned about a purported conflict between Judaism and science. And the fact that such a purported conflict often led to bad results. And so I was trying to address what happens when Judaism meets science. And as the process continued still, I'm now several years older than I was when I started it. Frankly, I started to think about legacy. I started to think whether somebody besides me would be interested in reading what I wrote. I started to think what would happen if the blog disappeared, which it could do by somebody apparently pushing a button. I started to wonder whether my children or my grandchildren might someday be interested in what I thought about things and what I had to say. And that convinced me to go for the book. And my wife introduced me to a publisher, and the publisher asked me to submit a table of contents and a sample chapter, and I did that. I got a go-ahead, and I spent just under a year putting things in shape and developing the kind of book I wanted, by which I mean a book that had a lot of footnotes so that you could check what I said. There are a lot of people that say a lot of things, especially about religion and about faith. But I wanted you to have the ability to check my sources. And this book has over 800 footnotes. I wanted to provide a bibliography so that you can drill down into some of the stuff I read. And the book has over 20 pages of literature that you can read if you wish. And I wanted to provide an index so that if you think you saw something in the book, but you can't remember where, maybe you can find it with the index. And between that and the editing process, as I say, we took about a year, and the book came out. And one of the wonderful things about having written a book is that with a little bit of luck, you get to go out and meet some interesting people. And have conversations like the one we're about to have. So I'm truly grateful for the congregation inviting me into its virtual home.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. This book was very well researched and referenced, and every page had at least one, if not multiple, footnotes. So it must have taken a large effort on your part to do all of this research and to organize it.
Well, we spent time doing it, that's for sure. But for those who practice law, and especially those who engage in litigation, amassing evidence and writing is what we always do.
Right.
So the subject, and from case to case, the subject changes. So this was a new case with a lot of chapters to it.
That's right. All right. Well, there was what I thought was one interesting. There were many passages that were interesting, but this one I thought was good for tonight. So let me read just this one short paragraph from the book. Consequently, when Jewish text meets science, we should accept the challenge to seek the truth behind the tale. Whether that challenge comes from the classical sciences or the social sciences, and whether by use of instruments or analysis, we should be prepared to meet the texts we encounter with critical thinking. This means testing premises, noting inconsistencies and anachronisms, and seeking confirmation, corroboration, or contradiction. The credibility of the text and our own integrity demand and deserve no less. So Roger, how does science help us to understand Judaism, or does Judaism help us to understand science?
It's going to depend on your particular topic, but let me give you let me start with two examples of what happens sometimes when Judaism meets science, and really why I was concerned as I was writing this book. Science teaches us that our universe is about 13.8 billion years old, that our planet is about 4.5 billion years old, that our species emerged over a long course of evolution, that the human family separated from its cousins, other primates, about 7 million years ago, and that our particular species, Homo sapiens, emerged about 250,000 years ago. This is a different story than you find in Genesis, whether it's the first Genesis story or the second Genesis story. Now, some people hear that science and they look at the Torah text and they talk to their rabbi and they talk to their friends and they can't reconcile the two. And their approach to this cognizant dissidence is to reject science. And we have people in the Jewish community who reject science. And I find that a tragedy. It's a tragedy for them, and it's a tragedy for the Jewish people. They are dooming themselves and their community to a life outside of modernity, and in many instances to a life of poverty, not just intellectual poverty, but economic poverty. That's a terrible situation. At the same time, we have some people who look at the science that I have just related. They look at the Torah text, the same Torah text, and they conclude that the Torah is a pack of lies, that in fact the Torah is fraudulent. They may say, well, it's a pious fraud, but it's a fraud nevertheless. And they leave Judaism. They reject Judaism. That's not good for the Jewish people. I mean, there's less than 15 million Jews on this planet. We can't afford to have people leave. And one of the reasons that people of the two groups that I mentioned leave is that they mistake what the Torah is. They think it's some history book or some science book. And the Torah is neither a history book nor a science book. I don't know whether your congregation uses Eitz Chaim.
Yes, we do.
There's a passage in Eitz Chaim, which I happen to cite in the book, that talks about how the Torah is not a science book. And if you were in a Reformed congregation, I would say you can look at the Plaut commentary, which basically says the same thing. And so what we do is we have to bring to bear the tools we have from science. And when I say science, I'm not just talking about physics and chemistry and biology, although I am talking about that. I'm talking about geology and archaeology and linguistics and art history and all those disciplines that bring critical thinking to bear on a subject. When you do that with the Torah text, I think you enrich the Torah text. You come to understand the Torah text better. You get a sense for what the authors of the text were trying to accomplish. And that makes the text so much richer than reading it as if we were reading it in Hebrew school. One of the problems and one of the challenges we face, and I don't mean we meaning the people who are here, but Jewish education more generally, is that our Judaism is Hebrew school Judaism, and it's essentially a pediatric form of Judaism. And we need to elevate that to a Judaism not for B'nai Israel, the children of Israel, but for Anshe Israel, the adults of Israel. And that's what you can do if you apply the lessons that science teaches. And I'm sure we'll talk about them over the course of the evening.
Thank you. All right. Now I'm gonna bring up Steve Jarrett's questions. They sort of continue off of this, so I think we'll continue with Steve. So throughout the book, you challenge the stories presented in the Tanakh, the Torah, and you sort of question the authorship of the Torah. So what is your concept of God, particularly in our modern scientific world?
My book speaks not very much about God, and I will tell you why. First of all, the book is about Judaism and science, and science really can't tell us very much at all about God. Science can't prove the existence of God, and science can't disprove the existence of God. And I should say at this point, parenthetically, I am not going to go down any rabbit hole of trying to define God here. That's a, you have to get somebody at a higher pay grade to do that. What science can do, though, is very important. Science can talk about things that were previously explained by God. And before the Enlightenment, pretty much everything was explained by a theory of God. Creation was explained by God, and the presence of humankind was explained by God. But science now teaches us that, as I indicated before, our universe is about 13.8 billion years old, and our planet is 4.5 billion years old. You can take the position that God, and they do that because of the standard model known colloquially as the Big Bang. And Big Bang theory, not the TV show, but the more scientific theory, is that billions of years ago, our universe, such as it was a very small, dense, hot bunch of stuff, and that it inflated and then started to expand, and that expansion has continued to this day. In fact, the expansion's accelerating. If you want to, and so science can take us pretty far back, but science can't tell us what happened before the Big Bang. Science can't tell us exactly why the Big Bang banged. Science can't even tell us that it really banged. And so there's this giant mystery there. Some people want to wonder whether God cause, and if you want to spend your time doing that, fine. But I didn't think that was a fruitful way to spend time in the book. But when we get to a topic like God fully fashioning a human, creating Adam out of Adamah, the human out of the soil, science can be pretty clearly indicate that that didn't happen that way. And if you look at the second Genesis story, which says that the female was taken out of the male's rib, I'm pretty sure that didn't happen according to that text. And so science can teach us some things about what the text says. Science can teach us about statements made in the Torah text. That's not telling us anything about what God is. It's telling us about what the story says. And one of the things I learned as I was going through this exercise was that there was a study made some years ago about scientists and religion and their view of God. And it turns out that when Jewish scientists were surveyed, 75% of them claimed to be atheists. Now, I have no idea why that is, but that's sort of a stunning number. And I think it comes about because the Torah text is not consistent in many ways with what modern science tells us. We could ask further questions. For instance, if for those who might believe that God was the intelligent designer of the human body, I'm not sure about your human body, but my spine and my knees tell me that's probably unlikely. And the circuitry of my nervous system and my veins and arteries tell me that's probably unlikely. Again, I think it's because many of us still have a conception that somehow this is the Torah is a historical text, or that it is a scientific text. And it's really not. Now, having said all this, it's also true that science doesn't know a lot. And in fact, the carbon and the hydrogen and the nitrogen and the other elements that make up my body and your body and this computer screen and your various computer screens and the chairs we're sitting on and the houses we live in and the planet itself and the moon and the sun and all the galaxies we see out there, if you add all that stuff up, you only get about 5% of the universe. The rest is, the scientists tell us, is something's called dark energy and dark matter. But if you ask them what that is, they really don't know. So there's a lot of mystery out there, and there's a lot of room for the theological thinking. But I learned a lesson which I included in the book, and I learned it from Yitz Greenberg, who's a modern Orthodox rabbi, a great thinker. And some 40 years ago, Yitz Greenberg was writing about post-Holocaust theology. And he said something I think is amazingly profound. He said, we should not say anything, theological or otherwise, that would not be credible when we were before burning children. Now that's an incredibly harsh standard. And Greenberg's resolution of that standard was that there was really nothing credible that we could say today theologically. I'm not sure that's true, but you did mention earlier that I had the great fortune to meet and study with Mordecai Kaplan some years back. And some of you may know that Kaplan was one of the two leading lights at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the 20th century, the other being Heschel. And Kaplan observed once upon a time that the idea of a supernatural God was sort of the alchemy and let's see, the alchemy and the astrology stage of religion. And Kaplan wanted to update religion to the chemistry stage and the physics stage. That was some time ago. There's another rabbi in the New York area, a conservative rabbi named Jeremy Kalmanowski. And Jeremy Kalmanowski, looking at modern cosmology, said, we need a faith befitting the cosmos. And I think that sounds great. I don't exactly know what he means, but it sounds like we're heading in the right direction. And I look forward to him developing that concept. But the reality is, for me at least, I am, until we get there, until the Kalmanowskis of the world refine those thoughts, I'm in Yitz Greenberg's camp. And I really have not heard anything credible from a theological sense, and I can't tell you how long. And so I can't answer Steve's question other than to say that I remain a confirmed and perhaps at times romantic agnostic.
Very good. All right, Steve had another question that's more on the science side. So Judaism pushes one to consider that science must be used in an ethical manner. What is Judaism's view on genetic alteration by CRISPR, both for disease prevention and cure, and for germline alteration?
Steve's question is a cutting edge question. So let me go back. Let me take a step back and talk about CRISPR for just a moment, because CRISPR is an acronym for a new technology which has really come to the fore, maybe in the last 5 years or so, that allows for the editing of human genetic material. It has been described as sort of the word processor for your genome, which is to say that with CRISPR technology you can remove a gene and you can replace a separate gene into the location of the removed gene. Now, why is that important? It's important because there are a large number of ailments, of diseases, which come about because of mutations in genes. I'll give you 2 examples. One is sickle cell anemia, and that that deprives the person who has it of appropriate oxygen in the bloodstream, and requires transfusions on a periodic basis, let's say once a month. And cystic fibrosis, which is also caused by a mutation of a single gene and adversely affects lungs and lifespan. There are a number of other diseases out there. There's 10,000, I guess, mutations in the human body, and there are some diseases that are caused by multiple issues. But those 2, for better or worse, are caused by a single gene. And so, in theory, if you could replace that gene, you could cure a disease. And in fact, there has been at least one clinical intervention with respect to a fellow who had sickle cell anemia, and it appears that he is cured in the sense that he does not have to have those monthly transfusions. That's miraculous. So what does Judaism have to say about this? And I should say, by the way, so far, we're at the early stages of this, and technology is well ahead of ethical conferences on this score, as it often is. Well, what do we have to say about this? There is a rabbi, I think the dean at Jewish Theological Seminary, part of the conservative movement, as you well know. And he has talked about two sets of approaches within the Jewish community. One is the preservationist approach, and the other is the interventionist approach. So what do the preservationists say? They prefer to look and maintain boundaries. They are concerned with interfering with what they view as life as given by God. And so they tend not to look kindly on this technology. The interventionists are those who believe that, at least from a theological standpoint, they're partners with God in repairing the problems that people face, that because they revere life, they seek to remedy ailments, and they seek to prolong life. So they're all, I wouldn't say they're all for this technology, but they're very much inclined towards this technology. Well, what are the issues, though, that we face? One of the issues is what diseases are we talking about? What constitutes a disease or flaw? I mentioned sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, and there's a long list of things that we could go through, from breast cancer, Huntington's disease, and on and on. But what about something like Down syndrome? What about deafness? What about being black or brown? What constitutes something that would qualify for genetic modification through CRISPR? And then, if you can solve those issues, we have the other issues of enhancement. What if you wanted to have blue eyes instead of brown eyes? What if you wanted to be 6 inches taller? What if you wanted to have a certain muscular strength? What if you wanted to have artistic strength, and it was discovered that there was a genetic component to this? Would enhancements be permissible or not permissible? And there is some literature on this, and there's even some Talmudic discussions about improving one's looks, not through genetic modification, but otherwise. So you have those issues, and then you have the issues of course, who pays for all this and who decides all these issues. But Steve also used another phrase in his question. He talked about germline editing. Everything that I have said up till now would take place in a cell other than a sperm cell, an egg cell, or an embryo. If you are dealing with a sperm cell, an egg cell, or an embryo, then you're talking about germline editing. And what's the big difference? The big difference is that if you cure one person of sickle cell anemia, you have cured one person. That person can still transmit the mutated gene. If you work on a sperm or egg cell or an embryo, you open up the possibility of changing a genetic situation for generations to come. And there are a host of questions, that all the questions that were asked before, times some large number, now arise. Do parents have the right to make that kind of decision? that will affect not just their child, but their grandchildren unto the fourth generation, as the Bible may say, or unto the 1,000th generation, as another passage might say. Might this kind of technology lead to a uniformity of look in a society? And what will that say about the people who don't look that way? And how do you deal with the situation? How do you ensure that it's not just the rich people who can do this? And how do you not exacerbate class distinctions? And I suppose somebody might say, should you exacerbate class distinctions? There is one other issue which sort of hovers over this in the Jewish community. And that is, the Jewish community has memory of a Nazi era where eugenics was attempted, performed, experimented. It's not a pleasant memory. And that tempers certainly germline editing thinking, but I think it tempers a lot of thinking. There's a law of unintended consequences. And we don't know what the unintended consequences are of this technology. We're not entirely sure about its safety. We're not entirely sure that if you address one gene, that you can be sure you haven't somehow done something to some other gene. We're not there yet. And so we have these two broad approaches that Rabbi Nevins talked about. We have a host of other considerations that I've identified very, very briefly. And I'm not even sure we're in the first inning of this discussion. We may be in the warm up before the game starts or something.
That's right.
This is going to be a doozy of a conversation.
Right. Just so you know, Susan pointed out that Jennifer Doudna convened a conference to discuss the ethical implications of CRISPR. So I hope that's an ongoing conference.
She shows up a lot on conferences, and Walter Isaacson has written a new book about her and about CRISPR. I think it's one of those things that if you're concerned about ethical issues and cutting edge issues, this is one that you probably ought to read up on.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Jay, and we'll see where he takes us.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Roger, by the way, I don't want you to get the misimpression that the problems we had getting onto the screen is symbolic of how disorganized our congregation is. We're usually even more disorganized.
Jay, as you may have heard, I too was a congregation president, and I'm sympathetic and empathetic with issues that you all have. But by the way, thank you for participating and taking the time to take a peek at my book.
Great. Well, it's great to have you here. I'm going to focus on chapters 5 and 11 of your book. Chapter 5, which you title "Let's Start Near the Very Beginning," and chapter 11, which you title "Is This Really the Torah That God Gave Moses at Sinai?" To chapter 5. During the past century, physics has appeared to establish a beginning of the universe, and it's not gone unnoticed that this is the same message given by the book of Genesis. Additionally, physics has shown that what we may regard as the void of an empty vacuum is actually very vibrant and gives rise to much of the phenomenon we observe on the very smallest scales. Indeed, it's widely recognized that the cosmology of far away and long ago is mirrored in many ways by the particle physics of the very tiniest granularity. And all of this is mirrored by the opening passage of the Old Testament. Much of this was covered in your section 5. Let's turn to your section 11. In this day and age, mathematics is the written language of much of science, especially physics. The physicist Paul Davies has likened the process of discovering science to that of reading the mind of God. He actually wrote a book that was called The Mind of God. Of course, we can only transcribe what we read from God's mind using the linguistic tools that are available to humans for transcription. It's also been said that those who make groundbreaking discoveries can only do so by, quote, standing on the shoulders of giants. Moses had very few tools available to him when he wrote the Old Testament. There was no mathematics and no known giant shoulders to stand on at the time. And as you point out in your section 11, one of the giant leaps that Moses took was to establish a written tradition which replaced the previous oral tradition. But Moses didn't have mathematics as a tool, so he wrote it down the best he could using the tools that he could. So the question I would ask to consider in this segment of the discussion is the extent to which in the book of Genesis, we might regard Moses as the world's first scientist, transcribing his reading of God's mind as best he could with the limited linguistic tools and absence of mathematics available to him at the time, and the apparent absence of any preceding giant human shoulders to stand
on. Thank you for that. For a minute, I thought I was going to have to reach one of my remaining yellow pads and write down what you were asking. I'm sure I don't remember all of what you just said, but let me begin by saying that I did not say in my book that Moses wrote the Torah, and I did not say in my book that I forget what your phrase was. That there was a textual revolution fomented by Moses. I did say there was a textual revolution that came about by the Torah. But chapter 11 asks a question. The question is the Torah we have today, the Torah that tradition says God gave to Moses at Sinai? And if you go through the analysis in that chapter, and indeed in the chapter before it, which talks about anachronisms, the answer to that, and of course you still need to read the whole book, folks, but the answer to that issue is that it's really very unlikely and not credible to think that somebody 3,300 years ago wrote the Torah text that we have today. And I'd like to spend a moment indicating why I think that is, and then I'm going to get to your science question. First of all, the Torah text is replete with anachronisms. Anachronisms are references to people or places or things that are out of sequence with the story that is set at a particular time. And I can give you a few of them because they're quite different, but they're instructive, I think. We're told in Genesis that Abraham's family comes from a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. Well, there is a place that was known as Ur, it's in modern-day Iraq, but it wasn't run by the Chaldeans until about the 6th or 7th century, before the Common Era. The story of Abraham, of course, is set 1,000 years before that. And if God gave Moses the Torah at Sinai, and that took place as the traditionalists and many commentators believe in the 13th century before the Common Era, then the author would not have known about the Chaldeans. Similarly, in the Torah text, there's a discussion of the tabernacle and the clothing that the priests would wear, and there's a reference to pants, priestly pants. But priestly pants weren't invented until about the 5th or 6th century by the Persians. So that reference doesn't make any sense in the text. And because we're approaching Passover, and I have it on my mind, we can talk about Goshen. Genesis tells us that Joseph brought his father and his father's family down to Goshen, which is presumably located in the eastern portion of the Nile Delta region. And then as the Israelites are about to leave to go to the Promised Land, they leave Goshen, they go to Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, and they make it through. That's the story we have. But a Canadian Egyptologist and an Israeli archaeologist have pointed out that the area in question in the Nile Delta region wasn't called Goshen until about the 7th century before the Common Era. So again, writing the text 1300 years before the Common Era, you wouldn't have known to use the word or the description Goshen. But that's not entirely the whole story. And I'll just give you one more problem, and then I'll try to reach your address the science question. When we talk about God giving or dictating the Torah to Moses at Sinai, you have to ask a couple of questions, which is one of which is, well, how much did he dictate? All 80,000 words? That seems unlikely. And more interestingly, perhaps, what language was it dictated in? What did Moses write it down as? I mean, they had been in Egypt for, depending on which story you read, 200 to 400 years. Did you write it in, was it in Egyptian and hieroglyphics? Was it in the common language of the day, which was Akkadian? Was it written in cuneiform, as many Akkadian texts were at that time? Probably wasn't written in Hebrew. There's no evidence that the Hebrew language was extant then, and certainly the Hebrew lettering that we know today did not exist. So did he write it in some Proto-Phoenician language? These are all very, serious questions if you want to take the position that the Torah was written by Moses or at God's direction. So I just want to be clear that that is not my position. I don't think the science supports that position in any way, shape, or form. And frankly, in the biblical academic world, I don't think there's very many people that take that position. So now let's get back to Moses as a scientist. I've already mentioned the problem with the formation of the first human. That does not comport with contemporary science as we know it. So I don't think Moses can be seen to be as a, or any author could be seen as a scientist. There's no scientific methodology that's involved. And we can go on to the next, another story, which is the story of the flood. The story of the flood contemplates that there was a worldwide flood. I can't remember exactly, but the rains lasted for 150 days or something like that. The whole earth is covered with water. Well, there's a lot of problems with that story, but one of those problems is the fish. Now, the fish aren't mentioned very much in the story, but the reality is there are saltwater fish and there are freshwater fish. And saltwater fish do not do well in fresh water, and freshwater fish can't handle the salinity of the open seas. So what happens if you have a worldwide flood and the saltwater and the freshwater mixed together? You're going to have a lot of dead fish. In addition to that, we have no evidence that any civilization was destroyed by a worldwide flood at the time that Noah would have had to have lived. Some architectural features that we have today were around at that time. They were around before the alleged flood, they're around after the alleged flood. if Moses wrote those stories, he wasn't very good. He wasn't a very good geologist or archaeologist or anthropologist or other kind of scientist. But what else does science tell us? Science tells us that there were other flood stories going back 3,000 years before the Common Era, many of them arising out of the Sumer region, where the Tigris and Euphrates come together in southern Iraq. And there were a series of these stories, no doubt arising out of the fact that this was a low floodplain and they had floods, and to them it must have seemed like the world was coming to an end. But in any event, they wrote these stories. You can trace these stories through their intellectual history until you get to the Noah story. And you can see that some words in those ancient stories found their way into the Noah story. What does that tell us? That tells us that the Noah story was built upon other ancient Near East traditions. It wasn't something that God gave to Moses at Sinai, or at least certainly unlikely that that would have occurred. And so with all that in mind, I guess my answer to your question is that I don't think, even assuming Moses existed, I don't see Moses as any sort of scientist. I'm guessing that Moses would not have considered him a scientist. The tradition teaches and the text shows that he was a very interesting leader with a horrible job of intermediating between a supreme being and a rambunctious people. Talk about not wanting to be a congregation president. How'd you like to be Moses? And he did, for a guy who couldn't speak, by the time he got into Deuteronomy, he's giving orations. I mean, it's a remarkable story, but it's not one that to me speaks anything at all about Moses having science skills.
Well, let me sort of bring you back to your section 5, starting near the very beginning. Let's just go to the Genesis story.
Sure.
The fact that the universe had a beginning has certainly been part of the biblical understanding for centuries, but it is really only in the 1910s and the 1920s that scientists found an expanding universe which mapped up with that. So you can say that Moses sort of knew something thousands of years before the scientists did, and in the last 50, 60 years what we've learned about the vacuum is the same sort of thing. You start from nothing, and then there are all sorts of fluctuations and oscillations in there, and all of these things come out of it, reminiscent of God starting from nothingness and then creating this and creating that, and let there be light, let there be earth, let there be water. Not exactly the same sequence. Obviously, there are temporal issues, and you talk about time dilation at one point in your chapter. But it seems, at least in that aspect, that Moses sort of got a few thousand years ahead of the scientists on that one.
Again, I'm not going to agree that it was Moses, but let's talk about the authors of the text.
Good.
And let's talk about the first Genesis story. The first Genesis story starts out not with nothing, but with chaos. And the story talks about how chaos is put into order through a series of differentiations and distinctions. And there are differences that are noted each day, and then there are differences that are noted between days 1, 2, and 3 and days 4, 5, and 6. And there is a seeming progression from simplicity to complexity, leading up to humankind. The question is, why would the authors write that kind of story? And how does their story differ from the other stories that we find in the ancient Near East around the same time or previously? And the answer is pretty interesting to those questions. Many of the ancient creation stories in the Near East are stories of battles between, without wanting to offend the ancient Assyrians and Sumerians, piddly gods. And they're fighting amongst themselves, and they're fighting with the people on Earth who they find to be intolerable. The biblical story contemplates a different kind of deity. It's not written strictly as a monotheistic text, but it contemplates a different kind of deity. Not a storm god and a war at this stage, not a storm god and a warrior god and a god of the moon and a god of the sun, but a single god who controls nature. That's a very novel and interesting approach. It doesn't conform to the science of our day, but it is very, very insightful. And the notion of differentiation is the origin of what I think Rabbi Nevins was talking about when he was talking about the, in a sense, the preservationists. There is a strong component in Judaism that sees order in the universe. And it begins in chapter 1, verse 1, with the delineations that are made over the 6-day period. But it's that sense that there is an order in the universe which informs the holiness code, and it informs various rules about not mixing seeds and not mixing kinds of cloth and not being like the other people. And it's a very dominant strain within the biblical text. We don't know what part of the text was written first or second or 40th. All we know is what we have in the text that we have received. And that text, it seems to me, is incredibly valuable because it sets up all of the important discussions that later take place with respect to this process of separation and identification and differentiation that we see coming on later in a variety of circumstances. I don't think, again, that that's a scientific discussion. I think it was a social, political, and religious discussion that there are differences that ought to be observed, and there's some value to those differences. And it may extend from the differences between the priests and the non-priests. And sometimes those differences cause fights between different classes of priests, and we see that in the Torah as well. But I think we sometimes make a mistake when we try to do something that the Torah is not really trying itself to do. The Torah is not claiming history; it's not claiming science, and a large part of my chapter 5 addresses the argument by an Orthodox fellow who was trying to essentially conflate Genesis with modern science. It's a fool's errand. And I think at your last session, Rabbi Jeff Middleman talked about how sometimes people try to justify or elevate or make Torah into something that it's not. And it's a terrible mistake. It's a marvelous document, just the way it is. And if we can understand, as I said before, more about who wrote it and why they wrote it, it becomes richer. It becomes richer and richer. But you know, it's not science 101. It's not history 101. I don't think it was ever intended to be.
All right. Well, thank you, and appreciate bringing in the Passover story, the Exodus story for our Passover. Now I'm going to turn it over to Susan Scharstein and let her take us on a journey.
That was kind of my plan. So I actually want to go forward, and the things that I found most interesting in the book were the ones that your later chapters that were speculating about exoplanets and the Jew droid. And I really particularly wanted to talk about that whole concept of artificial life. So I'm reading a novel, which was actually prompted by this, and it came up in my the feed that comes through. It's called Clara and the Sun, and it's a mildly dystopian novel, because these days all science fiction is mildly dystopian, about a society, which I think it's on Earth in the not very distant future, probably in the United States, where teenagers have artificial friends, and they call them AFs, and they are humanoid, they are intelligent, they have gender, though they clearly can be distinguished from people. And the book is called Clara and the Sun, and it is told from the perspective of Clara, who is the AF. And the child to whom Clara belongs has a potentially life-threatening illness, which appears, I haven't gotten all the way through the book, due to some genetic engineering to enhance the child's potential, which is common at that point. And Clara is so concerned about this that the child may die, right? And these AFs are solar powered, so she takes it into herself that the sun must be this omnipotent deity. And she goes to beseech the sun on behalf of Clara, and she goes to where there's this barn where the sun shines through right before it sets, very Stonehenge or Latin American, pyramids and things like that, and asks, she's a good child, she's kind, and I'll do for you. Look, I know you don't like pollution, so I'll destroy this pollution creating machine, right? So this author, right, has created androids or humanoids, right, that this one has her own, she's created her own religious sense. And we know that with artificial intelligence, we're not that far away from having the potential to have humanoids that are going to have intelligence and ration and all of those kinds of things. And how are we as humans, and what is Judaism going to take us and tell us about how we should engage with these artificial life forms? And then, the next step, of course, is going to be that I don't think we're probably not the only life in the universe, and there's a good chance we're not going to be the only intelligent life. And how are we going to engage as Jews, and that's probably a little further down the road, with those kinds of things that we haven't even been able to wrap our heads around?
Roger, I hope you had your yellow pad ready.
Should have brought 2 yellow pads. Well, first of all, before I forget, Susan, thank you for participating. Thank you for taking time to read the book. I'm not familiar with the book that you cited. So let me try to remind some people where we are today with respect to artificial intelligence. It wasn't too long ago that, not very many years ago, that for the first time we had artificial intelligence that could beat the world champion in the game of chess. Now, for those of you who play chess, this is a pretty good accomplishment. Shortly after that, we had artificial intelligence that could beat the world champion in a much more complex game, Asian game of Go. And in recent years, we've seen artificial intelligence enter our lives. There are robots in restaurants that not only take your order, but they chop your vegetables and they'll deliver the food to you, at such point as we ever get back into restaurants. There are robots that patrol malls. There are robots that deliver medicine in hospitals. There are robots that talk with patients in nursing homes. And there are robots that are beginning to perform religious tasks. A few years ago, in connection with the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, there was a robot that was installed in a church in Wittenberg in Germany that would provide blessings for people in 5 different languages, and you can pick the gender of your choice. And Catholics can now buy a little 18-inch robot that will give, that after listening to your concerns, will provide biblical lessons for you. Jews aren't quite there yet, but a few years ago at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, there was a robot that wrote a Torah scroll, wrote it as well as a scribe and in much less time. And I think last year or the year before, there was a robot in the San Francisco area that lit a menorah over Hanukkah by issuing a spark from its finger. So robots are all over the place. And one of the, and I think I share this thought with Susan, the robots are coming, right? And so in my book, I imagine a robot that's uploaded with all the literature and lore of the Jewish people. The Torah and the Talmud and the texts and the history books and the poetry and the drama and anything written by or about Jews is uploaded into this robot, which was shaped like a human. So it was an android, and now it's got all this literature and lore. So I call it a Jew droid. And the Jew droid is contemplating what it means to be Jewish one day and decides that being Jewish is more than knowing stuff. You have to be Jewish with Jews. You have to do Jewish stuff with Jewish people. And so the robot decides it, wants to join a synagogue. And the question is whether a synagogue will allow a robot in. Now, you all can think about whether your synagogue would allow the Jew droid in. But those kinds of issues are coming. The other issue that Susan mentioned is the question of life on other planets, and especially intelligent life. Now, I grew up watching, this is before your time, Susan, but I grew up watching Captain Video and Tom Corbett on television. They ran around to various planets. And then in the 60s, Star Trek came and they had somewhat more sophisticated planets. And then in the 70s, Star Wars came and that was even, more colorful. But the truth of the matter is we had never been to, or never even seen a planet outside our solar system. It's called an exoplanet. So this is all fiction, but about 30 years ago, we found one. We found an exoplanet, and now we found thousands of them. And not too long after that, we found exoplanets in the habitable zone of their host star, meaning in an area not too close, not too far from the star, such that under appropriate conditions, water could form on the surface of the planet. We've now identified, I think, 24 Earth-size exoplanets that are also rocky. We don't know whether there's any intelligence there. But if there is life on another planet, we are facing a new Genesis moment. And the question will be, from a theological sense, why did God create us in his image and place us in Eden and then create this other planet? What's that all about? And we will face other questions. What if that other life worships a different kind of God? I mean, again, to get to the Passover story, after the Israelites pass through Yam Suf and to get to the other side, they sing a song. And they sing a song that contains a line that people say every week, I think maybe daily, in daily services too. Micha mocha ba'elim Adonai. Who is like you among the other gods? That's a rhetorical question in the Torah text. But if we meet intelligent life from another planet and they have a bunch of other gods, what do we say to those other gods? Are gods still better than your God or your other gods? That's probably not going to be a very diplomatic encounter. And more particularly for the Jewish community, what will it say about the notion of chosenness? The notion that the Jews are a chosen people is an incredibly problematic one anyhow, just staying on Earth. Can you imagine going to another planet, to an exoplanet, and saying, we're the chosen ones on Earth, so you want to deal with us? Really? So we have those kinds of issues. And, let's not even get into the questions of, kashrut and holidays and things like that. Finding life on another planet is going to raise a host of very complex questions. And it'll be a real test to see whether Judaism can adapt to that new circumstance. As Judaism has miraculously adapted so well and so often over the last couple thousand years. I should note, Judaism will not be the only faith community having this issue. The Christian community will have similar questions. And some years ago, there was a German theologian who attended a United States government-sponsored discussion on aliens, on exoplanets. And the topic of his discussion was, did Jesus die for the Klingons? Now, to understand that issue, you have to understand Klingons are a warrior race in the Star Trek universe. But the thrust of the question was, if Jesus died for the sins of humans and now we encounter Klingons, what is that? What are the implications?
So if I ask a quick question, do you think that Judaism will approach these questions differently from other faith traditions?
There are some that they will share in common. For instance, why do we have this new Genesis event? There are ones that we do not share. The issue the German theologian raised is, we might say, I don't have a dog in that fight. So the Christian community will have to deal with that one. But we will have other issues, and the chosenness issue may be one. I don't know how these things will come out. The Jewish tradition has long seen God as Ribono Shel Olam, the master of the universe. But I think when it did so, it wasn't. It didn't have the same conception of the universe that we have today, and whether God can still be the master of the universe that is populated with other beings, I don't know. I know there's Jewish commentary to the effect that of course Judaism can accommodate other beings. It'll just show how miraculous and wonderful God is. I was about to say we'll see. I don't think we'll see in my lifetime. And the difficulties in communicating with life on planets that are many light years away is daunting, to say the least. So it's not clear to me that this is a real problem. The issue of robots and artificial intelligence, I think, is something that will be upon us really quickly. And we will have some very interesting questions to address with respect to that. But as much fun as space travel is when you read about it, you know, if something is even 50 light years away, by the time you send a signal and you get a response, you're long gone. So, you know, and in terms of travel, there is no way, based on our current technology and our current understanding, that we could go any place except maybe to Mars or possibly to a moon of Jupiter or something like that. So it's fun to talk about, but it doesn't have a lot of reality to it.
All right. Well, this gives me a lot to think about. Thank you, Susan, Jay, Steve, for preparing these questions. Thank you, Roger. There was a question in the chat that I think I know the topic was in your book, so you'll be able to address it easily. Many years ago, this is from Dan, many years ago I heard that some scientists had reconciled the Torah study of Genesis with the scientific record. After all, how long is one day when there is no sun or moon?
Thanks for the question, Dan. And I'll refer you to, I think Jay reminded me, it was chapter 5 of the book. There were a couple of books written by a gentleman who wants to conflate Torah and science. I'm trying to be gentle here, but I don't think he did a very good job. So for the details, you'd have to go into his system. But he misstates a lot of science, and he misstates some Torah along the way. If you do that, you can join them together perfectly. But if you want to take Torah as it is and science as it is, you really can't play. You really can't do what he tried to do. But I don't think we have the time to get into the details on that. But chapter 5 goes into excruciating detail on the errors of that particular kind of claim.
All right. Well, thank you. This has been a very interesting evening. I appreciate Roger. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Andy.
And thank you, Steve, Susan, and Jay. Appreciate your preparation for this and your insightful questions that Roger was able to discuss. Very, very interesting. So I just want to remind everyone that our next meeting will be next Thursday, and it's going to be with AIPAC. So up to this point, we've talked about the impact of modern science. We've talked about the relationship between Judaism and science. And today we had sort of a scientific examination of the Torah stories and discussions. And next week, we're going to have AIPAC.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So then after that.
Hello? Could somebody go on mute? Thank you. And so then after that, we're going to have AIPAC give us present some of the modern technology, advanced technologies that are being developed by in Israel. So please do join us next April 1st for this meeting. AIPAC has asked that you sign up. They obviously are interested in getting an email list. But I can tell you that it's going to be on the same Zoom meeting link that we are on tonight. But please do join us. It should be an interesting discussion next week on advanced technologies occurring in Israel. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for participating. Roger, I do recommend you're looking at Roger's book. It's very interesting. Also go to his website. There's a lot more interesting discussions there. And thank you, Jay. Thank you, Susan. And hopefully Steve will be able to join us again soon. With that, everyone have a wonderful Passover, Hag Sameach, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Sir Andy.